Thanks, Jason, for having me here today. It's working great. So, to be honest with you and with the audience, I was here a number of years ago, and I spoke to a large group of students. So as I prepared for today's event, I was thinking more about preparing for a large group of students. So, bear that in mind as I make my comments today. But before I kind of begin those comments, I wanted to also just touch on the sort of public intellectual theme and mention that I'm not sure if we have anything that I can write on here, but is there a, yeah. There we go. He is the man who's prepared. I'm going to preview right here a little bit of what I'm saying this afternoon. And this can also, I think, inform our broader discussions regarding the role of sort of public intellectuals in the national conversation on important issues dealing with the common good. So after I give my more formal remarks, what I'm going to have us think about in part, I think, is the way, and after Heather speaks as well, but I think we're kind of dealing with what I'm calling the marriage paradox today. And the paradox is this. I mean, I've been spending about 20 years underlining different ways in which marriage matters for kids and for adults. I'm going to do that again this afternoon in just a few minutes. And I think the research is beginning to tell us that marriage doesn't just matter, but it matters even more than ever. Because we're living in a world that's marked by growing economic inequality and economic precarity. And so the financial stability that marriage offers, which I'll talk about more in a second, is more important. We're living in a world where we're spending way too much time on these things and these things. We're kind of addicted to what I call electronic opiates. And so if you're a halfway decent spouse or a halfway decent parent, that necessarily limits your capacity to devote, almost all of your waking hours to a screen. And that's a good thing, right? So again, I think marriage and family matter in some ways more than ever because they protect us from becoming too much addicted to these devices. The third thing that I would say is that we're seeing a kind of a collapse of community. And this has been chronicled, of course, by Robert Putnam at Harvard. But I think the onset of these devices has sort of accelerated declines in religious and secular forms of community engagement. And the fourth point is that we're also living in a world, and it's actually also, I think, related to this too, where a lot of our common norms that would govern any number of things, including family life, are losing their binding power for us to kind of live together as a society and in our local communities. So we're kind of living more anomic lives, to use a more sociological term. So for all of these four reasons, I think that marriage and family matter more than ever because they tend to give us a measure of financial security. They protect us from becoming too addicted to our screens. They provide a certain basic level of in-person community. And then they also kind of provide a certain degree of normative sort of definition to our lives. So if you're a husband, a wife, a father, a mother, your life is much more likely to be kind of governed by a set of routines and obligations, to be sure, but things that kind of give direction to your life compared to if you have no spouse and no children. And again, that's more important today. So that's part of, I think, what's happening in marriage and family life. But at the same time, and this is sort of the paradox or the tragic irony, we're seeing marriage and family lose ground as formative institutions. So the marriage rate's gone down 60% since 1970. Our fertility rate is about 1.6, which is the lowest it's ever been in our nation's history. About 25% of the young adults here, in terms of in general across the US, will never have children, which is a record for the US as well. So institutionally, both marriage and parenthood are less likely to ground and guide our lives. And then, of course, as a kind of matter of public intellectual engagement, to kind of follow on Jason's introduction, it's much harder now to make the case in public for sort of the value of the institution of marriage. And again, this is a paradox or an irony, because as I'm looking at the data, I'm seeing more and more evidence that both for kids and for adults, I'm talking about kids today, again, marriage as an institution matters more than ever because of some larger economic and technological and social currents that are kind of playing out in American life. So that's just kind of my way of introducing my comments today on kids. And let's see here. So we're thinking about the welfare of kids today. And when you think about outcomes like mass incarceration, when you think about outcomes like depression for our adolescents, when you think about kids' odds of realizing the American dream, sort of you might think in terms of what are like the most central social forces affecting outcomes like the ones up on the screen. You might be thinking about things like race as the crucial predictor, or education, or of course here at an institution of higher education, or poverty as a major factor. And of course, all three of these things are integrally related to the things that I just began our conversation with. But when you look at the research, what you find is that there's some other factor that's actually a better predictor of mass incarceration, adolescent depression, and realizing the American dream, kind of from the community perspective. And that is the subject of our topic today, family. So let me kind of begin by giving you a story that kind of illustrates some of the key themes I'm going to talk about in greater detail today. I'm going to talk about Paul Davis. So when he was 8, after bouncing through 5 foster families in North Carolina, Paul Davis finally landed in a family who wished to adopt him. At last, the dizzying turns around the family go-round seemed over, as did much of the misbehavior that had followed in the wake of what seemed like a constant move from one family to another. Prior to moving in with Luke and Elaine Davis, his new adoptive parents, Paul had learned pickpocketing from older foster siblings. He tried to steal his 3rd grade teacher's wallet right out of her purse at school, and gotten into all sorts of other kinds of trouble. But after moving in with the Davises, things took a turn for the better. Quote, I had, a mom and a dad and a sister now, he recalled. But 2 years later, around Christmas time, his world was turned upside down yet again, as his adoptive parents sat him down for the talk. My mom and dad had sat my sister and I down and said that we're getting divorced, Paul recalls. And at the news, his 6-year-old sister got up to give a comforting hug to their parents, who were clearly both upset. But Paul stayed where he was across the room. He remembers feeling just emotionally cold at the prospect of taking yet another turn on the family go-round. And sure enough, the divorce ushered in a return to his previously bad behavior. Quote, I got in trouble at school and was sort of backsliding into older habits. He ignored school assignments, got into fights at recess, and was pulled over for driving drunk. And even though he's an exceedingly bright young man, Paul graduated high school with a 2.1 GPA, assumed college was not in his future, and headed off to the Army to start a new life. But after spending a few years in the Army, amazingly enough, through some kind of program that takes folks in the armed services and puts them back into college, Paul managed to get into Princeton. And at Princeton, he encountered a world like none that he had experienced before. One day, for instance, Paul was in the sociology of childhood class, and the professor asked the class to report how many of them were raised by their birth parents. In a class of 20, only Paul and one other student had not been raised by their own biological parents. Quote, "This was a shock to me, finding out 18 out of 20 students had been raised by their birth parents," Paul said. As he talked to other students about their lives, he discovered, quote, "The typical student at this place, they had both of their parents." However, he also discovered talking about family issues in class at Princeton was not easy. Quote, "My sense of it was that no one wants to talk about family. When the idea of family structure ever came up, quote, in any way, there was always an effort to bring it back to poverty," unquote. That's because most of his fellow students at Princeton didn't want to make, quote, normative value judgments about the family, so they retreated into ideas like, quote, "we just need to give people more money," unquote. So Paul's experience is emblematic of both how family structure matters for kids in the real world, but also of how difficult it is for our elites in the United States, public intellectual engagement, for our elites to address this issue about family and marriage head on and to address it truthfully. Instead, what they tend to do is embrace what I call a kind of family diversity theory. And this is the idea, as the screen here indicates, that all different types of families are kind of equally good for kids, that what really matters for children is kind of the love that they get from their parents and whatever kind of family form that takes. So it's kind of the attention and affection are what matter, not the specific structure of the family. And then provided, of course, that the family has sufficient financial resources. So again, kind of from the newer perspective, what really matters for kids is love and money, not marriage. This is kind of like the core idea that we kind of think about in terms of what I call, again, family diversity theory today. So from like the academy, we can think about these kinds of quotes. So from Pamela Jackson at Indiana University, talking about it's the quality of family life, not the number or structure when it comes to sort of the adults in the household. That's the top quote here from The Atlantic that she offered. So again, it's family process, not family structure. And of course, there's a kind of more materialistic assumption here as well, from Philip Cohen, the University of Maryland, talking about single mothers not really being an issue. What's really an issue is, income and lack of resources. Quote, "but family structure per se is not as big a factor." Okay, so again, the idea here really is that it's about love and money apart from the structure of families, apart from marriage per se. And this kind of thinking is not just found in the academy, it's of course in the pop culture. We have Katy Perry kind of discounting the importance of fathers in kids' lives, sort of talking about how she's got options and choices that she can make when it comes to forming her own family. And this sort of kind of choice-based argument is pretty common today, of course, in the larger culture. And we even have pundit proponents in the media. David Brooks has kind of evolved. I'll come back to him actually later on in the conversation, but I think he was more culturally conservative, maybe a decade ago, 15 years ago, but he's kind of evolved more recently and wrote a recent cover story for The Atlantic, kind of discounting the importance of the nuclear family and really discounting the importance of intact families more generally. So kind of an example of where our media class has gone, even folks who are kind of classically known as more center-right, as he was. And now even corporate America, which I would say even 10 years ago was at least residually more traditionalist, and a lot of it's different public utterances or messaging has kind of gotten in on the act with a much more progressive sort of set of messages on any number of issues, as we all know here. But this includes family stuff, and this is an ad for beer, which we'll try to get going here with. Yes.
You're nobody till somebody loves you. You're nobody till somebody.
Okay, so it was very traditional until we're getting to this point in the ad, and now it's becoming a lot more progressive here with this holiday, Christmas kind of festive messaging.
Nobody cares. Well, you're nobody till somebody loves. So find yourself somebody to love.
So again, Heineken is telling us about family traditions, Christmas traditions, all this kind of stuff, but kind of the family need not be traditional to be kind of a great thing to experience during the holiday season. So again, one more way in which we're kind of getting a celebration, this time from corporate America, of this sort of family diversity theory. So what's going on here, kind of, I think, culturally and intellectually, is a couple of different things that we can think about. One is the way in which there is a kind of expressive individualism that has emerged with particular force in American life since the 1970s, where we're elevating me as an individual, me seeking my own desires as a self, over the we of the family, over a more kind of familistic orientation that would have kind of held influence prior to the late 60s and 70s. And here, kind of, your own choices become much more important. Your own needs become much more important than recognizing the obligations that you might have to a spouse, to a marriage, and to kind of the integrity and the stability of your family. So kind of what makes you happy, what makes you fulfilled, what sort of serves your self's interest is much more important really since the 70s, obviously. The second point is that progressives tend to stress the importance of money, of social structure, in thinking about the family. So what matters here for families, again, as Philip Cohen was saying from the University of Maryland, is sort of how much financial resources they have. That's a kind of a crucial determinant of whether or not families are flourishing. And again, this is a kind of more progressive emphasis that focuses, again, on sort of these larger social structures as sort of the paramount thing. And the final piece, I think, here is that there is a pervasive assumption in our culture that progress, by its very nature, is a good thing. That sort of change is always kind of right and just and salutary. My colleague James Hunter at UVA has said this. He says, progressives believe that, quote, moral authority tends to be defined by the spirit of the modern age as a reality that's ever unfolding. And progress is liberation from older, archaic, and repressive traditions that would hold us back from living our more authentic lives. So again, the thought here is that what's new, what's different when it comes to American family life is a good thing. So these are the kinds of assumptions that undergird this newer approach to family life. Okay, so that's, I think, kind of by way of sort of setting the stage in terms of what's happening in the culture. But the question, right, is empirically, in part, how is family structure actually related to children's well-being? How does family structure, for instance, compare to money when it comes to predicting how well our kids are doing today in the 21st century? And then two, I think it's worth thinking as well about how all this is playing out differently for girls and boys, for young women and for young men. Because we're seeing today on many different fronts, and I don't know what the sort of ratio is here at Lee, we're seeing girls are flourishing a lot more when it comes to both education and at least early labor force performance. So it's worth kind of thinking about how the family might be intersecting with some of these newer gender trends that we're seeing playing out here in the US. So let's take education, since we're at Lee University. And I can begin just by speaking briefly about a guy I'm going to call John, the Jefferson Scholar at the University of Virginia. And at UVA, we've got a merit-based scholarship that gives students a full ride when it comes to both tuition and board, and also actually now gives them a generous stipend that they can use for their expenses. So it's a pretty nice deal. And this scholarship attracts thousands of applicants from across the world. They bring in 100 students every spring to UVA, and they award about 30 scholarships to high school seniors from across the globe and across the United States. And this scholarship is pretty diverse in terms of they've got kids, again, geographically who are diverse from a variety of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, different ideological perspectives. So again, on any number of different fronts, this is a pretty diverse crowd of talented students. But in one way in particular, what I've seen in kind of assessing them, because I'm involved in the sort of the process for selecting these students on many a year, is that when you look at their applications, what you see is that they're listing both of their parents, again, both of their parents at the same address. More than 80% of the applicants that I've seen have both of their parents residing at the same address, okay? So what's happening here is that there's a pattern in terms of family structure. And I saw this with one applicant who I will call John from the kind of Richmond area. And he talked to me about how both of his parents were incredibly involved in his life. His dad was an attorney, his mom was an accountant, and as I kind of talked to him about his family life growing up, it was just clear that they were just incredibly engaged in helping him navigate school and life more generally. His dad kind of taught him how to do public speaking and to debate. His mom was helpful in math and science. He also talked about his mom always made sure that his family went to church on Sunday and was kind of engaged in the civic arena in their local southern community. So you see kind of one example of the way in which having the benefit of two married parents gives kids a kind of leg up in life academically. And when we look at this in a more statistical sense, what we see is that kids who are coming from married birth parent families are more likely to be graduating from selective colleges across the university. And because we have academics, if you're interested kind of in the regression coefficients, what you can see here is that in this particular outcome, controlling for a variety of other factors here on the bottom of the screen, things like race and education and gender and composite achievement test scores, both family structure at the top and family income in the middle of the slide are highly predictive of graduating from selective colleges in the US. So John, in that sense, was not an outlier. Although, kind of to be completely honest here, it's clearly the case that for this outcome, money matters a bit more than your parents' marital status. Both matter, but here we can see that money is a better predictor than marriage. So again, we're kind of thinking about family structure, we're thinking about money versus marriage, and we're also thinking here about gender on a couple of different outcomes for kids. And also we'll just mention too that boys from non-intact families are the most likely, not just on this outcome, but on many educational outcomes, to be experiencing the most school failure. So again, on the sort of family structure front, what we're seeing is that it seems to be most important vis-a-vis both boys and girls for boys' performance both in elementary and high school and then also in college if they do go to college. But let's kind of shift our attention to another kind of important social outcome that we've talked a lot about in our national public conversation in recent years, and that is sort of incarceration. And that is the odds that boys and girls, particularly boys, kind of spend some time later on in either prison or in jail. And here it's worth noting that Paul, the young man that I was talking about just a few minutes ago, mentioned that none of his peers actually ended up graduating from college, our previous outcome, but a number of his peers ended up spending some time in prison or in jail when they were growing up as either teenagers or especially as young men. And here we can see there's a very strong association, just kind of at the bivariate level. And we're looking at actually the bars here in yellow on this particular outcome in terms of incarceration. So there's a strong bivariate association between your family structure growing up for both young men and for young women. And again, we can see when it comes to sort of this outcome that boys are experiencing kind of the worst set of patterns, particularly boys coming from non-intact families. On the left side here towards the bottom of this PowerPoint slide. And in a more kind of multivariate perspective, we can see for this outcome that both money and family or marriage matter for young men, but it's clearly the case that family structure or your parents' marital status is a better predictor of whether or not young men end up incarcerated than how wealthy their parents were. So on this social outcome, again, we're seeing that family structure seems to matter more. That's actually kind of what you see across a wide range of outcomes. On the educational attainment side, it's more about money, your family's money as a predictor, whereas on the sort of social outcomes like delinquency or incarceration, it's more likely to be the family structure, as is the case here. And then again, on the gender side, this is really about particularly young men and boys. Now, as scholars kind of think about, and psychologists think about in particular, kind of how kids, adolescents, and young adults are doing, they'll tell you that when they're in trouble, boys and young men are more likely to externalize, to be aggressive or delinquent, or to act out in some kind of visible way. Whereas girls, by contrast, are more likely to internalize, to turn inwards, and that's expressed in things like anxiety and depression. So the two outcomes we've just touched on are in some ways more about kind of externalizing. So let's turn now to this internalizing issue. And I have another story here to kind of get us thinking about the internalizing dynamic as it relates to family structure. So girls like Elizabeth or Liz Roberts in Rockville, Maryland would be kind of an example of what it is I'm getting at here. So Liz was doing pretty well in school and in life until she turned 12. She had A's and B's in school. She played soccer as a striker. She was involved in the church youth group at Faith United Methodist Church. She'd had her share of good friends. But all that changed one March afternoon in 2016. Liz was outside doing yard work with her mother, father, and brother, and her mother was none too happy with the job her dad was doing, edging the bushes at the periphery of their property. "I'm fed up with this," said her mom. "You never do what you're supposed to do. What I want you to do. I'm done." Now, Liz knew that there were tensions between her parents, but this was the first time that her mother had made a comment this definitive. She was flabbergasted when her mom just packed up her belongings and left the family home. So after her mom left, Liz's world collapsed. Her grades cratered, and her school counselor told her dad that she's smart, but she just doesn't do any work and doesn't focus. Liz suffered panic attacks at school. Her mood darkened, and so did her clothes, as she began to dress what's called, I guess, emo. And I've just learned this term, you may already know it, but dressing emo means wearing dark hoodies oftentimes. It means often wearing dark makeup and having dyed hair combed to partially cover your face. She also engaged in self-harm, cutting herself on her arms. Now, before this change in appearance, Liz has resembled her mom. But after she adapted the emo style, Liz looked nothing like her mom. That was the point. "I hate my mom," said Liz. "She left me, and she didn't protect me." Now, in her pain, Liz drifted into spending hours online, looking at random YouTube videos, posting on fake Instagram accounts, and participating in online chat groups dedicated to discussing dysfunctional families. This online activity just seemed to make her more depressed and more anxious. She's currently seeing a female therapist who's trying to model a healthy relationship with her to rebuild her capacity to be intimate, vulnerable, and connect to others. Right now, Liz's therapist is her primary adult attachment figure. So again, this story kind of tells us about the way in which family instability can be painful for kids, and particularly in some ways painful for girls. And it's emblematic of kind of a broader pattern we see here in my own research with Nicholas Zill, a psychologist, that is showing us that kids who are in non-intact families are more likely to be expressing sadness. And this is most likely to be expressed, as you can tell here in the middle, among adolescent girls. Okay, so again, both boys and girls are more likely to be kind of sad when their parents are not married and together, but this is most likely to be seen among teenage girls. And again, marriage or money? Marriage or money? This emotional or psychological outcome is clearly marriage. It's more closely connected to kids, to teens, odds of being depressed. And we do see in a lot of the research that, again, that when it comes to these emotional outcomes, that family structure is a better predictor than is money. Again, just sort of the gender story here is a bit different than what we've seen in the previous outcomes. And then the final outcome we can talk about is money for kids. And I'm going to come back to David Brooks, although it's important to note that Matthew Iglesias is talking about kind of an earlier incarnation of David Brooks when he was more conservative. Divorce is not a big deal if your parents are rich, okay? Not a big deal if mom and dad have lots of money. This was the takeaway of an article in Slate by the journalist Matthew Iglesias way back in 2013, where he's kind of going after David Brooks, that New York Times columnist, who was then more conservative than he is now. Based upon his own experience growing up in the upscale precincts of Manhattan, Iglesias took the view that divorce per se does not pose a long-term threat to the welfare of kids, so long as your parents are educated and affluent. Quote, "My anecdotal experience growing up in affluent circles in Manhattan was that parental marriage disruption is very hard on kids, even on rich kids. But that's hard, meaning that it's sad, not meaning that it's a substantial barrier to the kids going to college and maintaining a high socioeconomic status. My guess is that Brooks's kids will find their parents' breakup to be pretty upsetting, but they'll also get along fine in life, possessing all the various advantages that come from being David Brooks's children." Okay. Now it's worth noting that David Brooks is a multimillionaire based upon all of his book sales and whatnot. So like many on the left, Iglesias' thinking here is that money and education are what really matter for kids, and that family structure per se isn't all that important. And consequently, that the kind of family instability Brooks is worried about in his writings in his earlier incarnation would not be important for his own children. Because again, money, not marriage, is what matters for kids. So was Iglesias right? Now, I should have just sort of as a side note here that at that time, he was kind of like a financial reporter for Slate, and he was kind of known for kind of really digging deep with the data. Iglesias was known for that. What was kind of striking about this particular piece was there was not one reference to any data, okay? And we do see actually in the research is that when it comes to, for instance, economic mobility for young adults who are raised in rich families, there is a link to family structure. They're 40% more likely to stay rich and 25% less likely to end up poor as young adults. You kind of can see this sort of playing out in this study from Pew, the Pew Research Center. And this is kind of looking at kids who've all grown up in families in the upper third of the income strata in American life here. Okay, and so what it's showing us is that if you grew up in that sort of richer bracket in the United States and your parents remain stably married on the left side of this illustration, you're much more likely to be yourself rich as an adult. That's the blue bar. But if your parents got divorced, you're less likely to remain in that rich bar on the right, and you're more likely to fall into the yellow middle class bar or the purple poor bar as an adult. Okay, so again, Iglesias was not correct in his assessment. We also know that kids who are coming from affluent families are half as likely, they're twice as likely to have their parents contacted by schools for behavioral problems, and they are, if their parents are stably married, more likely to graduate from college. So again, kids from affluent families whose parents are stably married are half as likely to have their parents contacted by school for behavioral problems, and they're 33% more likely to graduate from college. So again, what we're seeing here is that for rich kids, they're doing better in terms of behavioral problems, college graduation, and their income in midlife when their parents remain stably married, compared to their peers whose parents get divorced. But of course, we're not concerned just here with rich parents. Think about kids more generally, and what we see is there's a very strong association between your parents' marital status and your odds of experiencing poverty. I mean, these are obviously quite dramatic differences when it comes to child poverty that are linked to family structure. And then when it comes to kind of realizing the American dream in terms of being either in the middle class or the upper class in your 30s, what we can see is that both men and women are more likely to reach the middle class or higher. That's in red in this particular slide, if their parents remain stably married, compared to their peers whose parents either never married or ended up divorced. And in a multivariate context, we can see here is that marriage matters a bit more than money, and it matters about the same for both young men and for young women in this particular economic outcome. There's not really a gendered story here. So kind of putting these things together, we can see that in truth, kids from stable married families are the ones most likely to be excelling in school, steering clear of prison, flourishing emotionally, and realizing the American dream today. And in studies looking at, again, mass incarceration, for instance, depression, for instance, and the American dream in terms of mobility, going from rags to riches, from being poor as a child to being affluent as an adult. Family structure matters more than race, than education and income. And you need not trust my word here. You can look at the work of Raj Chetty at Harvard, who has found in his work on community factors across the US that the sort of single best predictor of whether or not kids in a community tend to make it into the upper class if they're coming from poverty is the number or the share of single parent families in their community. So again, this is kind of one indication of how much what goes on in our households matters not just for individual kids, but for also larger communities across America. Now, I want to be clear as I kind of wrap up my comments, my formal comments, that coming from a non-intact family is not a death sentence. Okay, I was raised by a single mother. All the folks pictured here came from non-intact families and did well, at least professionally. So we can kind of, I think, acknowledge and appreciate that there's heterogeneity for our kids, and that many kids who come from non-intact families end up doing just fine. But I'm also a sociologist, and what I'm saying is that on average, kids are more likely to struggle when they don't have the benefit of their own married parents on the home front. And that's because stably married parents, on average, are more likely to give their kids more love, more money, and these things are important in terms of their capacity to thrive. Okay? So, for instance, we know that kids in intact married parent families get more attention and affection from their parents. We know they get more material support from their parents as well. Okay? And so remember that kind of progressives think that what matters for kids is not marriage, not family structure, but love and money, right? Love and money. But what they don't always seem to, I think, or often recognize is that love and money, as measured with the kinds of things that I mentioned in the previous slide, are more likely to be found in intact married families. So we can kind of think here about the way in which, in his famous Father's Day speech from 2008, in the midst of his first successful campaign for the presidency, Barack Obama put it in this way, quote, "Of all the rocks upon which we build our lives, we're reminded today that the family is the most important. We know the statistics. The children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty, crime, they're more likely to have behavioral problems, run away from home, or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it." Today we can see that statistics tell us a similar story about the importance of family structure for children, a story that stands in direct contrast to the family diversity theory. It's not just love and money that matter for our kids, it's also marriage that matters for them and for their communities. So Obama concluded that Father's Day speech by observing that for parents, your life doesn't count for much unless you're willing to do your part to leave your children and all children a better world. He said, "We do what we can to build our house upon the sturdiest rock," he said. When it comes to family life, the science tells us the firmest foundation for our children is a home headed by their own married parents. And that's it for me for now. Thank you.